Choosing the correct depth of field is one of the most important aspects of composing an image because depth of field determines what part of the image is acceptably sharp. Depth of field depends on the aperture of the lens, the focal length, the focus distance, and the circle of confusion. So when you're planning an image, wouldn't it be helpful to figure out what settings to use in order to get your desired depth of field and also to know where to focus in the scene in order to achieve the depth of field you want with those settings? Well, guess what? You can with PhotoPills, and I'll show you how right after this. Hey there, photographers, Brenda Petrella here, and welcome to another episode of PhotoPills Friday, where we unlock the power of the PhotoPills app without all the confusion. In today's episode, we're going to learn how to use the depth of field map tool available inside the map settings of the planner. In episode 6 of PhotoPills Friday, we learned about how to use the field of view map tool, and the depth of field map tool builds upon that feature. So if you haven't yet watched episode 6, I highly recommend you check it out. Depth of field is the area or region of a scene that's considered acceptably sharp, and therefore everything before and everything after the depth of field is not usually in focus. Now, I'm not using the words tack sharp on purpose because there's only one point in a photo that can be actually tack sharp, and that's the focus point. And everything else within the depth of field is what's called acceptably sharp. In landscape images, we're often trying to maximize our depth of field to get as much of the scene in focus as possible, depending on the composition, of course. And one way to do this is to use the hyperfocal distance. If you don't fully understand the concepts of depth of field or the hyperfocal distance, then I recommend you check out my hyperfocal distance video where I review these concepts in much more detail. To demonstrate how to use the depth of field map tool, I'm going to load a saved plan into the planner, and I've included a link in the description below if you want to download this plan and follow along. This is a plan I created of the full moon rising just above the tip of the Nubble Lighthouse in York, Maine. So to load a saved plan, just go to My Stuff, click on Plans, find the plan that you want, click on it, and then at the bottom, click on Action, then click on Send to Planner. This will automatically load the plan into the planner, and you will see that the red pin is at my shooting location and the black pin is set on the Nubble Lighthouse. Now I have my map set to satellite, so if you want your screen to look similar to mine, just click on the map settings button at the bottom right corner of the map and click on Map Type, and then click on Satellite. While we're here in the map settings, go ahead and turn off any map layers that we don't need right now by clicking on the eyeball icon next to each layer to toggle them on or off. And we only really want the moon map layer on right now if you're following along with this plan. Okay, so while we're here in the map settings, now let's turn on the depth of field map tool by clicking on the DOF box under Map Tools and click Done or Back. Now you'll notice a bunch of things have been added to the planner, and it looks very similar to what we saw in episode 6 when we learned about the field of view map tool, and that's because we see the field of view map overlay while using the depth of field tool. So the icons located just below the top bar are the same as what we found in the field of view map tool, with the addition of one icon that represents the aperture. So let's quickly go through these now. The first icon that looks like a camera is where you would input your camera body. And remember that if your camera has a crop factor, that factor will be automatically taken into consideration with the various calculations within this tool. The next icon that looks like two triangles pointing at each other is where you would set the focal length you want to use, which determines the field of view. You can also input information about a teleconverter if you plan to use one. So in this plan, I've already determined what I want my field of view to be, and the resulting focal length required to achieve that from my shooting location with my camera is 125 millimeters. Because I don't want that field of view to change as I play around with my depth of field, I'm going to select Lock Focal Length on Map. The next icon looks like an aperture, and this is where you would set your aperture. As I said earlier, aperture affects the depth of field. So the wider the aperture or the lower the f-stop number, the shallower the depth of field, and the narrower the aperture or the higher the f-stop number, the deeper the depth of field. So let's just set the aperture for f8 for now, because that's a good starting place. The next icon looks like a small square attached to a triangle, and this represents the focus distance, or the distance between your shooting location and the point that you're focusing on. If you click the icon, you can either set a custom distance, say that the focus distance will be at the black pin distance, or you can set the focus distance at the hyperfocal distance. Now, if you don't have a foreground element that you want to include in your image, then you don't really need to worry about the hyperfocal distance per se. You can just focus on your subject, like the lighthouse in this case. The hyperfocal distance comes in handy when you would like to maximize the depth of field and include something in the foreground with something in the background. So for now, let's just assume we don't have anything in the foreground and choose our focus distance to be at the distance of the black pin. The next icon is a rectangle representing the orientation of the image, whether it's in landscape or portrait mode, and you can toggle back and forth between the two by simply clicking on the icon, and I'm going to leave mine at landscape mode for now. The next icon looks like a circle with 4 dots. And this represents the shooting direction, or the direction you're pointing your camera at, and it's measured as an azimuth line. We can input the azimuth if we know what it is, or we can tell PhotoPills to align the shooting direction with the black pin, or to always align it with the black pin, which will lock the shooting direction to the black pin. And for now, I'm going to select always align with the black pin so that the field of view and the shooting direction don't change as we fiddle around with the map. Okay, so now let's look at the map. You may need to zoom your map in or out to see exactly what I'm seeing on my map. As before with the field of view map tool, we see an overlay on the map that shows the field of view between 2 gray lines and the shooting direction as a gray dotted line. Also, as before, the red line that connects the 2 outer lines of the field of view represents the focus distance. And since I set my focus distance as being the same as the black pin distance, the red line intersects with the black pin. Note that next to the red line is the focus distance icon, which is the same as the one above, and it also displays the actual focus distance. Now let's zoom over to the red pin area. Here you will see 2 more lines and 2 more icons. The light blue line and the evergreen tree icon represent the hyperfocal distance, and the light gray line with the icon that looks like a line with a circle next to it is the depth of field near limit. The depth of field near limit is just a fancy way of saying the distance between your camera and the beginning of the depth of field. And so the depth of field far limit is the distance between your camera and the end of the depth of field. And in this case, with our camera to subject focus distance and our other settings, our depth of field far limit is infinity. And the depth of field far limit icon is shown in the lower left corner of the map, symbolized by a circle with a line, and right next to it is the symbol for infinity, showing that the far limit is at infinity. So what this information is telling us is that if we shoot at a focal length of 125 millimeters, an aperture of f8, and we focus at the black pin, then everything from the depth of field near limit out to infinity will be in focus. So if we don't want to include anything in the foreground, then we can just leave the plan at that and focus on the lighthouse. However, if we zoom in on the red pin, you'll see that there are some big rocks in front of us that we could potentially include in the composition. So what aperture would we need to use to get the depth of field to include those rocks? Well, to start, I know that to maximize the depth of field, I need to change my focus distance to be the hyperfocal distance and not the distance to the black pin. This is if I want to get a single image and not do focus stacking, which is another way to maximize the depth of field. So the first thing that I'm going to do is click on the focus distance icon at the top. Here I'm going to select hyperfocal distance and click done. Now if I zoom out, you'll see that the red line is no longer intersecting with the black pin. And in fact, the red line is not even shown because it is the same as the hyperfocal distance, which is displayed as a blue line. So if we zoom in on the blue line, you'll see that the hyperfocal distance icon is listed to the left of the blue line, and the focus distance is listed to the right of the blue line, and that's because the hyperfocal distance and the focus distance are the same thing. Remember that when you focus at the hyperfocal distance, everything from half that distance out to infinity will be acceptably sharp. And it's important to note that if you set your focus distance at the hyperfocal distance, then the depth of field near limit will be equivalent to half the hyperfocal distance. So we can now use the near limit line as a reference for what will be acceptably sharp if we focus at the hyperfocal distance. So right now, those foreground rocks would not be in focus with our current settings of 125 millimeters and an aperture of f8. So let's try decreasing our aperture or raising the f-stop number to increase the depth of field. So now let's try f18. If we zoom in, you'll now see that at f18, the depth of field near limit overlaps with those foreground rocks. So if I focus at the hyperfocal distance, everything from those foreground rocks out to the moon should be acceptably sharp. Now, just a quick side note, you'll see that the hyperfocal distance, the blue line, is in the middle of the ocean, which makes it very difficult to figure out where to actually set your focus point once you're there. So to overcome this, what you can do is play around with the red pin location and move it back a little bit so that the hyperfocal distance is actually on an object that you can focus on. So if I just move my red button back a little bit, I can get the hyperfocal distance to be on those rocks. So you can set your hyperfocal distance on an object that you can actually focus on. And this may not work for all situations, but it's something worth playing around with when you're planning an image. So this tool helps us really dial in our camera settings and modify our shooting location in order to achieve the image we want. Now, one more quick note, to the right of the depth of field tool icons at the top are 3 stacked lines. And if you tap on those, you will get the depth of field and hyperfocal distance measurements and a little cartoon showing those measurements so that you have a better visual understanding of what they may mean. Now, there's one more map tool in the map settings that will help you plan sun and moon images. And it's especially helpful if you're interested in getting the sun or moon at a certain size in your image relative to your subject. So in our next PhotoPills Friday, we'll learn how to use the sun and moon map tool. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.